the pressure off the brethren and to put some pressure on the sisters. So it's their turn. They did a very good job over lunch, although I didn't get to experience it, but you did. And now it's their turn to come into the spotlight. It doesn't mean we're going to take all the pressure off Abraham, so don't get too comfortable, brethren, because he does have some reason for us to perhaps reflect upon another bad decision that he makes here in Genesis chapter 16. We've taken this title, as you probably saw from the reading from Genesis chapter 16, and at verse 5, Yahweh Judge between me and thee, says Sarai to Abram. Because of course this is some 13 years or 14 years before the change of the names of these two, our father and our mother. Abram, exalted, lofty father, in chapter 17, 13 years after the events of chapter 16, is renamed Abraham. And Sarai, 13 or 14 years later, is renamed Sarah. We're going to see the reason for that change, and we're going to see its application to the title of our studies, Heirs Together of the Grace of Life. So here we are. Now, I want you to have a look at this series of extracts from a 1950s home economics book. This is particularly for the sisters, but the brethren will enjoy this. Now, this is what life was like when I was a baby. You know, I was born in 1949, so, you know, when I was a young fellow, 4, 5, 6 years of age, they were printing books like this. This was the Woman's Weekly type magazines of the day. You know, they're full of junk nowadays. This one's probably not, you know, it's not 100%, but it's the way the world was back in the 1950s. And it's quite astonishing, the difference between then and now. So here is the advice. Tips to look after your husband. Have dinner ready. Plan ahead. Even the night before, to have a delicious meal on time. This is a way of letting him know that you have been thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you will be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup. Well, I wouldn't suggest that for our sisters, but anyway, put a ribbon in your hair and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work-weary people. Clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives, gathering up school books, toys, paper, etc. Then run a dust cloth over the tables. Prepare your children. Take a few minutes to wash the children's hands and faces. If they are small, comb their hair and if necessary change their clothes. They are little treasures, and he would like to see them playing the part. Make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair or suggest he lie down in the bedroom. Have a cool... This of course happens to you, brethren, today, doesn't it? You know all about this. This is everyday experience. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him. Arrange his pillow and offer to take off his shoes. I mean, this is not... I'm not making this up. This comes from a 1950s magazine that was published and bought by. They paid money for this. Make the evening his. Never complain if he does not take you out to dinner or to other places of entertainment. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure, his need to be home and to relax. So what do you reckon? Well, there's more. Listen to him. You may have a dozen things to tell him. Let him talk first. The goal? Try to make your home a place of peace and order where your husband can renew himself in body and spirit. 1950s. You reckon that would go down pretty well today in 2011? It'd be like a lead balloon, wouldn't it? In today's society. So that's what? 60 years? In 60 years, brothers and sisters, the world has done a U-turn. It's going the other way. Now, whether or not you agree with that, that's beside the point. You see where I'm coming from. Why was society like that in the 1950s? Did they have it all right? Probably not. Is this advice totally consistent with scriptural teaching? Some of it was, maybe not all of it. But it came from the Bible. That's where it came from. But today it's different, isn't it? Nothing comes from the Bible today. Society is not governed by biblical principles anymore, even wonky ones. All right, it's not governed by it. It's a totally different world. So, what is wrong with it, if anything? I'm asking these questions because at the end of this session today, I'm going to read, not from a book from the 1950s, but a book from the late 1840s. It's a book called Elpis Israel, written towards the end of 1848 and published in January 1849. So I'm going to read out a section of Elpis Israel, which today would go down like a lead balloon in modern society. I'm going to ask you, particularly the sisters, how you react to it. Even the brethren, I'm going to ask you how you react to that. I mean, I don't expect to get any negative responses at all from you. But I am going to ask you. I'm going to ask you whether you feel comfortable about it. We're going to test to see how much liberty, equality and fraternity have marinated our attitudes and our disposition. And if it has, then we need to sit up and say, well, listen, we've got to rechart our course. We've got to get back on a track. We've got to get back to the truth as it was expressed by our pioneer brethren. Has anything changed? Were they wrong? Is the modern world right and Brother Thomas wrong? That's the question we've got to ask ourselves. And I'll tell you, I've done this before, so this is not the first time for me. And as I said to you in an earlier session, I've seen some discomfort in the audience. Real discomfort. I didn't come there to make them uncomfortable. I didn't come there to make them sit in an armchair either. This is the Bible we're dealing with. This is about eternal life. This is about getting into the kingdom. And Christ says some won't get into the kingdom because of liberty, equality and fraternity. And I don't want that to be you. And I don't want it to be me. So this is about saving people's lives, and I don't care how uncomfortable they are. If this is going to save lives, then I'll do it, because that's what the Bible does. So I've prepared you for it, haven't I? So if you want to go now, you can go, because that's what's coming up at the end of this session. Can you see anything right with this? Well, there's a lot right with it, actually, even though I wouldn't necessarily lay on my wife all of the things that you read in that 1950s magazine. I don't ask her to take my shoes off when I come home. And in fact, when we were raising children, I used to change what you call diapers here. We call them nappies in Australia. Not because my wife insisted upon it, because I wanted to help out with the children. Okay, so, I'm partly modern husband, you might say. But, no, I don't go along with the stuff that's being demanded by modern wives of their husbands. I can tell you that right now. Now, where's all this come from? This nonsense. Where has it come from? Well, it's come from liberty, equality and fraternity working through such things as the Women's Liberation Movement. And in 1975, the United Nations held the International Women's Year. It was a watershed year in human history. And it's brought about the situation we see today in our modern world. And since that time, women have sought and largely gained around the world government-sponsored affirmative action programs, which means, brethren, don't even bother putting your resume in, because I'll give the job to a woman. I was a human resources manager. I know there was heavy preference given to women because they wanted women to break through the glass ceiling in the places of employment. They gave women the right to have their own career, unhindered by family commitment. Why should children get in the way of your career, they say to women. Equality with men in the workplace. We call it EEO in Australia, equal employment opportunity. Equal pay and promotional opportunities. Government and employer subsidised child care facilities, sometimes on the work site, so you can bring your children, give them to someone else to look after while you go and sit in your office. Okay? That's what happens in Australia. Equality in the church. You know, I've driven around, done 11,000 miles in North America, been past many churches, and I take a little bit of notice when I see on the signs. Almost half the signs have got a woman as the minister or the priest or the whatever. And that happens. 30 years ago? No. You'd never see it. You see it today. And some of the consequences of that, disappearance of traditional family life, and rapidly increasing rate of divorce and remarriage. And a growing number of de facto marriages. So they jump in and out of marriages today like they're changing their socks, don't they? This one doesn't work, you jump into another one. That's what it means when Christ says marrying and being given in marriage. That's what he means in Luke 17 and Matthew 24. And the emergence of step-families through remarriage. And fully 35% of children who attend public school in Australia go home to one parent who's not their natural parent. 35% of our kids at school in Australia. And the dramatic growth of dining out for evening meals because mum goes to work. She's not going to come home and slave over the stove and cook a meal. So what do? You go to McDonald's or some other place. Poison yourself. Okay? That's what happens. Men forced to accept domestic duties. You know, the keynote address given at the conference held in Mexico in 1975 was given by a French woman. This is what she said. No woman should be authorised to stay at home to raise her children. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women in 1975, she means, would make that one, not today. It is a way of forcing women in a certain direction, she said. We see it as part of a global reform of society which would not accept that old segregation between men and women in the home and the outside world. We think that every individual woman as well as man should work outside and have the possibility either by communal living, collectives, or another way of organising the family of solving the problem of childcare. Now listen to her words. The problem of childcare? I didn't find bringing up children a problem, did you? Because we try to follow biblical ways and principles. And it's not a problem. Has God got a problem bringing us up as his children? Is he regarded as a problem? Well, you know, we are a problem, aren't we? We're not always very cooperative as children, but is it a problem to God? I think it's a problem. The kids get in the way of my career. You know, I've got to pay $250 for some other person to look after my kids so I can go and have my career and bully and boss men around at work. She says this, in my opinion, as long as the family and the myth of maternity, goodness me, and the maternal instinct are not destroyed, women will still be oppressed. This is liberty, equality and fraternity in all its glory, if you could use that word. And this is what it produces. Divorce. The scourge of the latter days. I'll tell you the Australian experience. On the introduction of the Family Law Act, introduced by a fellow called Lionel Murphy, whose name has gone into infamy in history in Australia, the filthy, grubby man that he was. He introduced the Family Law Act in 1975 under a Labor government. They couldn't wait to get into power to change social policy in Australia, and they did a pretty good job of it. There were, in the first year of the operation of the Family Law Act in 1976, there were 63,230 divorces and 110,000 marriages. So people were using, they couldn't wait to get in there and use this act to get a divorce within 12 months of separation. And that's what happened. We only got a population of 21 million or less. When this was, I don't know what Canada's population is, what is it? 40 million? 35 million? Well, you almost double us. 63,000 divorces in the 1 year. There were 45,600 divorces in 1992. And the average duration of marriages in the 90s was less than 10 years in Australia. The average age of divorcees was 38.7 years for men, 35.9 women, which you can see the men are more patient than the women. 2 in 3 first marriages and 1 in 2 second marriages end in divorce. Now that wouldn't be happening if divine principles were in play, would it? Just would not be happening. You know, Brother Roberts wrote in the Law of Moses these well-known words about God's design in marriage, about counterparts. You know, when he says, I'll make him a help meet for him or fit for him, the word in the Hebrew means a counterpart. And it has the idea, if you can just sort of imagine this, kids that love this, you know, you have a wall of plasticine. You have plasticine or Play-Doh, okay? So a wall of plasticine, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run headlong into it. All right? And then come out. What do I leave behind? Not a very pleasant image, actually, but there's an impression, isn't there? That's what that word means. So God says, I'm going to make a counterpart, someone who exactly matches Adam, so that they might together manifest the character of God. Because we know that God gave to man a greater tendency towards what we might call the executive qualities of the divine character. You know, the management, the decision making, those kinds of things. Doesn't mean women haven't got it, just they don't have it in the same degree as the man. And he gave to the woman much more of his sympathetic and empathetic, his compassionate qualities, you know, the maternal type qualities, because God is both. He's executive, and he's got the other, compassion, you know, the maternal side as well. So he says, I'll give man more of that and woman more of this, and they'll work together, man and wife, and he will draw out of her the latent executive qualities that are there, all right? He will help her develop that side, and she will help him develop this side, which is why I'm such a gentle person. Because, you know, you ask my brother about me. I'm the oldest son in the family, you know. Someone asked him in North America, you Jim's brother? He said, yeah, I'm the nice one. Which means I'm not nice, see. And I was always known to be sort of fairly upfront, okay? Not necessarily very gentle, but I'm much gentler now than what I used to be. Guess who done that? A lovely lady that I married. My wife, who's one of the gems of God's creation. Because of the Word of God. That's why. She draws out of me things that might not come out of me. And I think I've given her something. She keeps telling me on the phone, we miss you. We miss you. I said, why do you miss me? Well, because when you're around, everything seems to go okay. When you go, the wheels fall off. Okay? Well, I did. I left the day after. It had huge floods. It was the wheels fell off. My daughter broke a pelvis, and there's all sorts of disasters going on. Well, it wasn't like, you know, it wouldn't have been any different if I'd been there. But you get the idea. You know where I'm coming from, don't you? And that's what Brother Roberts meant when he wrote this. He says, man is for strength, judgment, and achievement. Woman is for grace, sympathy, and ministration. Between them, they form a beautiful unit, heirs together of the grace of life. I'm going to come back to that phrase a little later on, when we've laid out some of Sarah's or Sarai's warts, and we see a mistake that she made for which she pays dearly, brothers. You always pay. You can be forgiven sins and forgiven mistakes, but you always have to suffer the consequences. You make wrong decisions, wrong choices, you have to suffer the consequences. How and why? Well, because that's how God teaches you. That's how he eradicates the problem from your life. Okay, that's what he's doing. And of course, she does make a mistake, doesn't she, in Genesis chapter 16. So let's come back now to Genesis. Let's have a look at the start of this story of Genesis 16. It all begins back in chapter 15 and verse 4. Because as you know, Abram was concerned as to how the promise would be fulfilled to him. He had no seed. He says, is this Eliezer my heir? And God says, no. Verse 4 of Genesis 15. And behold, the word of Yahweh came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. Do you think that God's forgotten something here? You think he could have said, out of thy bowels and from Sarah, or Sarai thy wife? He doesn't put that in there, does he? You think God's sort of absent-minded? No. It's deliberate. Quite deliberate. He doesn't tell Abram that this son that he's promising is going to come from his wife, Sarai. So that's what brings about chapter 16. Because they start to think. And it's not that many months down the track from the promise being given in Genesis 15 that the events of chapter 16 are undertaken. So Abraham's 85 years of age in Genesis 15. He's 86 when Ishmael is born. And then there's a gap. 13 years. You read nothing about Abraham. Nothing. Completely silent. For 13 years. And chapter 17 verse 1 says, now Abraham was 99 years of age. We're told the last verse of chapter 16 he was 86. The next verse says he's 99. 13 years. I'll tell you what, they were the most agonising years of Sarai's life. Horrible. Absolutely horrible. Because of the decision that she takes in Genesis chapter 16. Let's look at verses 1 to 3. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. And she had a handmaid, an Egyptian. I wonder where they got this handmaid from. You got it. You got it in one. From Egypt. In other words, they wouldn't have had Hagar if Abraham hadn't made a wrong decision. Okay? You suffer the consequences of your decisions. So she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. The word means flight, according to Josenius. And she does take flight shortly, doesn't she? Because of the pressure that's put on her by Sarai. And it says this, verse 2. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, Yahweh hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, and it may be that I may obtain children. The word actually is banar, it means to build. That I may build by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So you want to have a little note in your margin back to Genesis 3 verse 17. We'll come back to this point in a moment. I said we're not going to leave the brethren untouched here. Because the very first thing that God said to Adam, he's dealt with the serpent, he's dealt with Eve, very first thing he says, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, cursed. That's his problem. Okay? Now we'll come back to that. That's Genesis 3 verse 17. What about this name Sarai? Well, as you can see on the screen, Sarai's name means dominative. And that's exactly what she does here. She dominates the family. She's making decisions for the family. And she takes control and insists that Abram marry Hagar. In verses 4 to 6, we see the wheels fall off. Verse 3 says, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after he dwelt 10 years in the land. That's why we know he's 85, see? Came in when he was 75. Verse 4. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw, that is, when Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress, Sarai, was despised in her eyes. You know, they found that Bible principles are true. You know, this is an amazing thing, isn't it? And we make decisions, and we think we're doing this for the right reason. Do you think that she had a good motivation here? That Sarai said, look, take Hagar and we'll produce children. We want to fulfill the promises of God. We believe the promises of God, don't we, Abram? Come on, let's get into it. Let's get stuck into it. So the motivation is terrific, isn't it? It's just wrong method, that's all. It's like Rebecca, when she says to Jacob, go and deceive your father and we'll pinch the blessing he's going to give to Esau. Terrific motive. Wrong method. You don't deceive your father. Don't lie to your father to get a blessing. Come on. Okay? So she's motivated by the right things, just wrong methods. Her interference backfires. Proverbs chapter 30 verse 23 proves true. You know what it says? There are three things, yea, four, that make the earth quake. It quakes and quivers. And one of them is when a handmaid is heir to a mistress. Because human pride can't handle it. That's what that section of Proverbs is about. Human pride can't handle it. And Hagar couldn't handle it. She's an Egyptian slave. Now all of a sudden she's got a child by Abram. And she's going to bring forth a seed, which Sarah thinks is a promised seed. Come on. So human pride comes to the fore. And so the wheels fall off. Verse 5. And Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee, or as one translation puts it, the RSV. May the wrong done to me be on you. Well, hang on, Sarah. You were the one that put pressure on Abram. Alright? So she's now pointing back to him. Yes, and in a sense she's right, because he should have said, look, get your act together, Sarai. God's made a promise. He'll fulfill it. We don't need to manipulate it. We don't need to get in there and do his bit. Let's just wait on God. And in due time, he will bring forth the seed. Abraham didn't do that. He should have taken control. He should have wrested control back from Sarai, but he didn't. So now they've got a huge problem. Of course, we read on in verse 6. It says this. Well, let's just read the end of verse 5. So I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. Yahweh Judge between me and thee. Now the Companion Bible suggests, giving a note from Ginsburg, that it might read, Yahweh Judge between me and her. And Rotherham actually has her in his translation. But I'm going to stick with what's there in the AV. It says, Yahweh Judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. Now if you think that Sarai is actually acting unreasonably towards Hagar, forget it. Because that word that's rendered there, dealt hardly, is actually translated, the very same Hebrew word is actually translated in verse 9, submit. Alright? Submit. And so in verse 9, God is actually saying that he agrees with the treatment that Sarai dealt out to Hagar. Because all that Sarai asked Hagar to do was to submit, to act like a slave, not like a princess. Because that's what she was doing. Take your rightful place. You might be pregnant with my husband's child, but take your right. You're a slave, remember? Don't go around here huffing and puffing like a princess. You be a slave. Well, of course, Hagar wasn't content with that, was she? And so the record of verse 7 says this, that the angel of Yahweh found her by a fountain. So she's run away. She's run away from Abram and Sarai. And the angel finds her by a fountain of water in the wilderness on the way to Shur. And of course, there's a discussion goes on. In verse 9, the angel says to her, you return to your mistress and you submit yourself. Same word as dealt hardly. Submit yourself under her hands, because Sarah had done right. And the angel of Yahweh said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And straight away, brothers and sisters, we're in the allegory that Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 4. You know, you say, who's the father of the Arabs? Answer? Ishmael. True. Yeah. Does God regard Ishmael as the father of the Arabs? Well, he's the natural father of the Arabs, but God's not interested in that. He is not interested in Ishmael being the father of the Arabs. As far as God's concerned, Ishmael's the father of natural Israel, Jews living under law. Let me prove that to you. So let's read down. Where's this coming from, do you think, this 10th verse? I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. That's Genesis 17 verse 20. Okay? And the angel says unto Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh says unto her in verse 11, behold, thou art with child, and thou shalt bear a son. They shall call his name Ishmael. Hail will hear, because Yahweh hath heard thy affliction. That's Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. Because when Jacob took his family into Egypt and they multiplied in Egypt, and the Egyptians oppressed them, what did they do? They cried unto Yahweh. You know what it says there? And Yahweh heard their affliction. Okay? So we've got a story. This is an allegory. Read on, verse 12. And he will be a wild ass of a man. Now, when our brother Gary read that out, the version he was reading has got donkey in it, hasn't it? That's the NIV, I think, isn't it?
ESV.
Okay. ESV? Well, ESV uses the same translation as the NIV. Because the word ass is there in Hebrew. So if you haven't got this note, if you've got the AV like me, you've got to put the word ass in. This is how it should read. And he will be a wild ass of an Adam. That's the Hebrew words. Now why the ass, do you think? Well, because the ass is the symbol for Israel. So he's going to be a wild ass of an Adam. Then it says this, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Now somebody who's very quick can look that up while I go on. Someone? One brother, please, in the audience. Young brother. Who's got it? Ben, you going to do that for me? You didn't think you were going to have it? You thought you were going to go to sleep, didn't you? Okay. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Listen to me, brothers and sisters, while Ben's looking that up. I'm going to read on. And he shall dwell in the presence. The word presence is pani. It means face. He shall dwell under the face of all his brethren. What's that about? Or do you dwell in the presence of your brethren? Yes. I mean, you're looking at me. So I'm dwelling in your presence right now. You know what that means? If you want to note about this, note down Matthew chapter 23 and verse 5. Because when Christ came to law-keeping Jews, who he said, listen to them, do what they say, but don't do what they do. Because it's all a public show. All their works they do to be seen of men. They want to dwell in the presence of their brethren. Everything they do is designed for public consumption. You know how Ishmael dies in Genesis 25, in verse 18? He died in the presence of all his brethren. And that's where law-keeping Jews end up. They get their glory today, but there's nothing tomorrow. They die in the presence of their brethren. You live for public consumption, watch out. That's what it's saying. But if you're like Isaac, you know where you're going to go? You're going to go to the place where Hagar didn't want to be. When she names this world, read on. Verse 13, she called the name of Yahweh that spake to her, thou God seest me, for she said, have I also here looked after him that seeth me? She was resentful. This was an unusual experience for her. It's the first time she suddenly realised that God sees inside her heart. And he knows what she's thinking. Oh, this is a new experience. So when she names this place, in verse 14, wherefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one, my beholder, it's actually out of resentment. And that's exactly how the Jews operated under law. They kept law for public consumption. And Christ came along and said, you're corrupt, you're covetous. And they hated him for it. They didn't want to be exposed. And even a man like Nicodemus, who became a Christadelphian, crept up to Christ at night time. You know what Christ said to him? Men love darkness because their deeds are evil. He that comes to the light comes because he wants his deeds exposed. Okay? So this is an allegory. Ishmael represents natural Israel under law. This is how they operate. Ben, you're right, mate?
It is 4:13.
It is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Loud voice, please.
2:14 and 15.
Mm-hmm.
For ye, brethren, became followers of the churches of God, which are in Judea, and are in Christ Jesus, for ye also suffered like things of your own countrymen, even as they have of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us. And they believe not God, and they are contrary to all men.
Yeah. See what he's saying about the Jews? They killed their own Messiah. And he says, they're contrary to all men. That's exactly what it says here in Genesis chapter 16. When it says in verse 12, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Contrary to all men. That's the character of the race, isn't it? Even to this day. So brothers and sisters, what we have here is an allegory. Now I didn't mean to spend too much time on that, but I think you can see that when Ishmael is born, by a mistake made by Sarai, when she takes control of the house, Yahweh says, okay, I can even work with that. Is anything too hard for Yahweh? No. He can take the mistake of Abram and Sarai and make an allegory out of it about his whole plan and purpose with Jew and Gentile. Incredible, isn't it? It's incredible what our God can do. So God intervenes, he demands Hagar's submission. And there's a principle, a lesson we have to learn from this, brothers and sisters. When a divine principle has to be submerged to achieve a divine objective, the method must be wrong. So your objective might be fine. Your intent might be terrific. But if you don't use divine principles, then the method is wrong. And divine principles were at stake here. Sarai had dominated Abram, and Abram had hearkened to her voice. What about Abram's leadership in this matter? Why didn't he refuse Sarai's ardent request? Okay, brothers, it's your turn. Truthfully, be truthful to yourself. Put yourself in Abram's shoes. Your wife is insisting that you take another woman. How many men would argue strenuously about taking another wife if there was no cost? And your wife agreed with it. You'd have a second woman. Hey, that's not bad, hey? Forget it. Jacob had 4. It was a disaster. He should have just stuck with the one that God gave him. Her name was Leah. And if he'd stuck with Leah and had realised that he'd made a mistake in choosing the beautiful girl over the spiritual girl, then we wouldn't have had all the tribulations of his life, would we? He wouldn't have gone through all that. End up with 4 wives in the end. Forget it. Just stick with one. Much easier. So Abram is at fault here too. Because thou hast hearkened to the voice of thy wife, said Yahweh to Adam. That was the grounds of his condemnation. But there is always a cost, isn't there? There's always a cost. And Brother Thomas in Ilpus Israel says this: a man should never permit the words of a woman to intervene between him and the laws of his God. One man, one woman for life. Abram understood that principle. When he took a second on his wife's insistence, pain came into his family. Serious pain. And that pain fell heavily upon Sarai because she was the one responsible. And for the next 13 or 14 years, brothers and sisters, in fact longer than that, right up until the time that Hagar and Ishmael are chased out of Abram's house in Genesis 21, so we're looking at 18 or 19 years, incredible turmoil in that family. Because, I can't imagine Hagar when she has Ishmael, she's gone back, she's submitted herself. I can't imagine Hagar not doing a Penina. Penina. She made Hannah's life miserable, didn't she? Because Penina could have children. So she's producing the progeny of Elkanah. And Hannah can't have children. And Penina would just be gently reminding her in the kitchen, well, I've got to go and comb the hair of my little ones here. And Hannah doesn't have any little ones. And that's what it would have been like. As Ishmael grew up, Hagar would be smiling at Sarah and saying, yeah, okay. Pain. Wrong decision, you pay the price. But God's at work here too, isn't he? He uses the folly of human beings to cleanse them sometimes. And he's cleansing Abram and Sarai. So eventually, 13 years later, he changes their names. Let's come to Genesis 17. There's a marvellous thing in this. It's an absolutely marvellous thing. Their names are changed, and in the changing of their names, Sarah's submission to Abram is memorialised. So let's have a look at what happens here. This is the As For chapter. Did you know that, brothers and sisters? You want to do a little bit of highlighting in your Bible? This is the As For chapter. You have a look at verse 4. As for me, says Yahweh, behold, my covenant is with thee. Have a look at verse 9. And God said unto Abram, thou shalt keep my covenant. I'd be interested to know what your translation says, Gary, for verse 9. The words, in mine thou shalt keep my covenant. What does it say?
It says, and God said to Abraham, as for you...
Exactly. Good translation. That's how it should read. So you've got as for me, so God's talking in verse 4. Then he turns to Abram in verse 9. He says, as for you, Abram. Then you come to verse 15, and God said unto Abram, as for Sarai. Then you come to verse 20, as for Ishmael. See, it's the as for chapter. We'll have a look at Isaiah 59 verse 20 one day. And you'll find that's picked up, that phrase. As for. Okay? That's just an aside. But this is the kind of thing you find when you come to it. This is an incredible chapter. It's Genesis chapter 17. And here, God is about to change Abram's name. He says in verse 4, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, an exalted or lofty father, but thy name shall be Abraham, a father of a multitude. For a father of many nations have I made thee. So what Yahweh does with Abram's name is to add a letter. And he adds the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which has a numerical value of 5, to the 5th position of Abram's name. Now guess what? Genesis 17 is the 5th appearance by Yahweh to Abram to make the 5th of 7 promises. Interesting, eh? 5th appearance, the 5th promise, puts the number 5, the letter, with a value of 5, it's the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, into the 5th position of his name. So that you see, he's not messing around. There's a precision here. Incredible precision. Now it so happens that the name Abram has a numerical value of 243. Now you're all aware, of course, that both the Hebrew and the Greek have numerical values. English doesn't, but Hebrew, Greek does. So therefore you can establish the numerical value of every word, every phrase, every sentence in the Bible. And there was a gentleman who lived in Canada called Ivan Panin. Anyone ever heard of Ivan Panin? He got into biblical numerology in a way that no other man ever has, and found some astonishing things. He found, for example, that every piece of scripture is undergirded by the number 7, which is very appropriate because 7 just happens to be, amongst other things, the number of the Spirit. And starting with Genesis 1 verse 1, he shows that there's this incredible pattern of undergirding, so that there's this pattern of 7. You know that men have tried to duplicate that, and they can't. Not even with a simple sentence. They can't do it. Every single sentence in the Bible is undergirded by 7s. Panin discovered that. That's how he knows that Mark 16, for example. They say part of Mark 16 is not there? Forget it. It's got the pattern of 7s. That's why in 1 John chapter 5, you know, the interpolation of 1 John 5, it shouldn't be there. Why? It doesn't have the pattern of 7s. So you see, you can actually tell what's actual scripture and what isn't actual scripture. So look him up, Ivan Panin. He wrote several books. P-A-N-I-N. Ivan Panin. He was a Russian who came to Canada. Spent his whole life looking at biblical numerics. And God put these things there. I mean, that's why he does it. That's why he chose Hebrew and Greek, because they're both alphabets where you have numbers tied to each letter. So you start with Aleph in the Hebrew. Guess what its value is? 1. Beth, the next one. Guess what its value is? 2. You get to He, which is what he puts into his name. Value, it's the 5th letter of the alphabet. Value, 5. So when you work out the numerical value of Abram, it's 243. God puts the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet with a numerical value of 5 in the 5th position. He gets a numerical value of 248. Which just so happens the name Abraham occurs 248 times in the Bible. But that's quite accidental, of course. Maybe not. You see, that's the way God works, isn't it? So what he does, he takes Abram, which has 5 letters. Now you're also aware, aren't you, that there are no such things as vowels in the Hebrew text. You've only got consonants. You actually have to establish the vowels by the word and the context. So when the Sophron came along, they put the vowels in the margin. But there are vowels in these words, of course. So here you've got 5 letters. There are 4 consonants in the name Abram and 1 vowel. Okay? So the name Abraham has 7 letters, 5 consonants and 2 vowels. It's not interesting. He goes from 5 letters to 7. By divine grace, this man is going to secure a covenant. Okay? I will make thee a father of a multitude of nations. So having done that to Abram's name in this chapter, what does he do to Sarai's name? Well, we come to her in verse 15. And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. Now Sarah means princess. Sarai means dominative. And the last time I heard, princesses were subject to the prince, weren't they? Who would you say was the more important, the greater, the one with the more authority? The prince or the princess? Now, of course, Charles and Diana messed all this up. But who would you say is supposed to be the more prominent, prince or princess? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? So now this name memorialises her submission to Abram. So what does God do to her name? Well, this is what he does. 5 being the biblical number of grace. Verse 15, Yahweh replaced the 5th letter of Sarai. Do you notice I said replace? Whereas he inserted a letter into Abram's name, he actually takes one out of Sarai's name and puts another one in its place. He replaces the 5th letter of Sarai's name with a numerical value of 10 with the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet with a numerical value of 5. So her value's gone down, hasn't it? Abraham's went up by 5. Hers has gone down by 5. Now Sarai has a numerical value of 510. It's 5 letters, 3 consonants and 2 vowels. Sarah has a numerical value of 505, has 5 letters, 3 consonants and 2 vowels. So there's actually no change in the terms of the consonant vowel structure of her name, but there is a change in her numerical value. Whereas Abram's gone up by 5, she's gone down by 5. Mathematicians in the room, please, the difference now. Well, he's gone up by 5, she's gone down by 5.
10.
Accurate. Yeah, 10. Yeah, of course. 10. That's why I got 10 fingers. Okay? 10 fingers, and I think I've got 10 toes. How about you? Alright? Why 10? Why 10 commandments? Why 10 phrases to the Lord's Prayer? Why 10 toes? Why 10 horns? Why? I could go on forever, couldn't I? Why 10? Why 10 nations in Psalm 83? Why 10 nations in Genesis 15, verse 18? Be removed from the land so that Abraham's seed can possess it. Why 10, do you think? Well, 10 stands for all. That's why you had to give a tenth as a tithe. Because when you gave a tenth, you were giving all. You were saying that all of this came from God. I can't give it all back because I need to eat, okay? But I'll give a tenth. That represents all. I'm saying it all comes from God. So 10 stands for all. It's the number of ordinal perfection. So he's gone up by 5 through divine grace. She's gone down by 5 through divine grace. This is exactly what Peter means in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. When he says, brothers and sisters, that we, and he's just used Abram and Sarah as his example. He says, we are heirs together of the grace of life. What's Peter's context in 1 Peter 3 verses 1 to 7? What's his context? The submission of wives to their husbands, even when the husband is an unbeliever. That's his context. And he says in that context that Sarah called Abram Lord in her heart, even when he failed her. Isn't that incredible? So when God changes their names, Abraham goes up by 5, she goes down by 5. And it memorialises Sarah's submission to her husband, who was far from perfect. That's a classic way, isn't it? A classic way of driving home a very simple principle. So when you hear these words, heirs together the grace of life at a wedding, I'll tell you something. 99% of those who are getting married on that day got no clue. No clue as to why that statement's in the Bible. When every time we go to a lot of weddings in Australia. In Adelaide you can go to a wedding every week, every weekend. There are that many of them. You've got 400 young people, they're marrying like flies. You know? There's a wedding every week. And if you happen to be related like I am to many people, you get invited. That's why I'm in Queensland. I want to go to a wedding. Don't tell anybody I said that. But every time I go to a wedding, you know, I get the piece of paper. Yes, together the grace of life. And I think to myself, they got no idea. They have no idea what that means. Because the next thing you hear is that that sister is doing her own thing in that family, wants her own career, not interested in building a marriage. And the next thing you hear is that they're split up. Why? They have no idea what that statement means. Got it? Do I need to repeat anything there? Was that pretty obvious? That's how the Bible memorialises the principle of being heirs together of the grace of life. I'm going to finish this study now by having a look at very briefly at Proverbs 31. I'm going to apply the Alpha Israel test. Okay? So if you don't want to have the Alpha Israel test, go to sleep now. Because it's coming up, won't be long. Proverbs chapter 31. Now we haven't got time to go through this in any great detail, but here is the alphabet of womanly excellence. In Proverbs chapter 31 from verse 10 to the end of that chapter. You know, it's the 8th section of the book of Proverbs. Why? Because this leads to immortality. 8 is the biblical number for immortality. You get this right, this is where it ends up. The 8th part of the book of Proverbs. Starts in verse 10 about her excellent value. Who can find a virtuous? The Hebrew word is kail, means force or able. So this is about moral qualities. It's about strength. Strength in moral qualities. Who can find a woman that's got strength in her moral qualities? You can find one of them. Her price is far above rubies. Goes on in verses 11 and 12 to talk about her excellent character. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so he doesn't have need for additional gain. That's what spoil means, additional gain. Verses 13 to 15, it speaks about her industry, her activity. In verses 16 to 18, her prudence and motivation. In verse 19, her practised skill. She layeth her hands to the spindle and her hands to hold the distaff. Verse 20, her considerate kindness of the needs of others. She stretcheth out her hand. This is the word here, by the way. There's 2 words for hands. And the word hands in verse 19, the first one, layeth her hands, is yad, means an open hand, a generous hand. But the second word, hands, in verse 19 is kaf. Okay? So here there's a different word for a reason. I'll let you explore that in your own time. Verse 21 speaks about her wisdom. Verse 22, her furnishings and her attractive dress. Verse 23, her reputation. Her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land, because he's got the support at home. Verse 24, her industrious initiative. She maketh fine linen. And I thought fine linen represented a covering, didn't it? Fine linen, clean and white. She maketh fine linen. We know, brothers and sisters, that this is actually about womanly excellence, but it's really about the bride of Christ. It's about the bride of Christ. Someone's needed at home, I think. So we go on. Verse 25, it speaks about her moral strength. Strength and honour are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. Verse 26, her wise tongue, she considers. Before she opens her mouth, she considers the effect, the impact of her words. Verse 27, her motherly instincts and her obligations are fulfilled. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. In verses 28 and 29, we have the response of her family. Her children arise up and call her blessed. You know, one of the great things, isn't it, in the truth, is that when we as children grow up into adults and we look back, you know, it's not the done thing, is it, for young people nowadays to treat their parents with respect, is it? Respect is gone from our society. I'll tell you a story. Have I got time for a story? I'll tell you a story. I put a lot of time into my son. From about 6 or 7 years of age, I'd take him camping several times a year. We'd go in the bush, just Dad and the boy, fishing and walking and doing all the things that dads and boys do, you know. I mean, his father's a bit decrepit, but anyway, his father did his best. And we built up a relationship. We did that right until he was 18 or 19 years of age. I used to tell this to the fellows at work. And I'd say, you know, my son, he's 19. We went camping the other day. They look at me as though I'd come from Mars. And one guy said to me, he said, you know, my son, he's only 13. He wouldn't be seen dead with me. I was like, oh no, my boy, he wants to go everywhere with me. You know, when he was 20, my son was 20. We've got this agricultural show. It's good family, you know, fun. And you take your family. You've probably got these things in Canada, haven't you? You have agricultural shows here? Yeah, okay. Well, now we used to take the family along, you know, and you watch the horses jump over hurdles and all sorts of things like that. And you walk around, look at the sheep and the cows, and yeah, it's good, healthy family fun. Well, along came. He was 20, and I'd been taking him for, you know, many years, and I was a bit tired of it. And I knew that on this particular day that the young people were going. This is his compatriots in the meeting, the young people. And I said, oh, I'll fix theirs. So I said, hey Ben, because he asked me, can you take me to the show, Dad? And I said, well, Ben, the young people are going, aren't they? He says, yeah, they are. He says, Dad, I don't want to go with the young people. I want to go with you. And I said to him, mate, okay, let's go. You know, I still get cards from my son. He's 25 years of age. Dad, you are my best friend. That doesn't come, does it, without a little bit of input. And you get your rewards in the end. That's exactly what happens to this woman. Now, that's exactly what happens to this woman. See there? Verse 28. Her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praiseth her. The reason my son's not married? He's looking for a woman like his mother. There are not too many of them. Okay. He's looking for someone like his mother. He's as close to his mother as he is to his father. See? My wife's getting her reward, isn't she? Many daughters have done virtuously, verse 29, but thou excellest them all. And this is the reason for her virtue, isn't it? Verse 30. Favour is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth Yahweh, she shall be praised. Not only by her children and by her husband, but at the judgment seat of Christ. And that's what really counts, isn't it? Verse 31, the rewards come. Give her of the fruit of her hands. The word hands there is yad, open hand. This is because this woman gives and gives and gives and gives with an open hand. And let her own works praise her in the gates. Publicly, that is. And the day will come when virtuous women like that will be publicly praised for their commitment to the building of the divine family. And basically that's what we're about, isn't it? Here, this is terrific, isn't it? It's an incentive to carry on and to implement divine principles in our family life. So here comes the Elpis Israel test. This is what Brother Thomas says in Elpis Israel, I should say. We hear much in some parts of the world of the political rights and equality of women with men, and of their preaching and teaching in public assemblies. We need wonder at nothing which emanates from the unenlightened thinking of sinful flesh. There is no absurdity too monstrous to be sanctified by unspiritualized animal intellect. Men do not think according to God's thinking, and therefore it is they run into the most unscriptural conceits, among which may be enumerated the political and social equality of women. Imagine reading that out in the Canadian Parliament. You got halfway through that before they started throwing rotten eggs at you, you'd be lucky, wouldn't you? And they might even frog march you out and put you on trial for breaking the anti-discrimination laws of your country. True? This is 1848. In our brotherhood, we have movements afoot. One of them is called the Women's Speak movement. Heard of that? They sent to every ecclesia, you might be far out, too far away, but they sent to every ecclesia a book called All One in Christ Jesus. Heard of that? It's coming out in the last few weeks. I got one in the car, it's at Halifax. Okay? And that book sets out to undermine every single biblical passage that deals with the position of the woman in relation to the man. Every one of them. And it's taking hold in our brotherhood. And if Christ doesn't come soon, most of our ecclesial world will be marinated by that kind of idiotic, wonky thinking. So be on your guard, because it's happening. Where I come from, we've got ecclesias that have been, they don't call themselves ecclesias, by the way. The one in Adelaide's called a church, because they don't want to be known as an ecclesia, a called out community, because they're aping the church. And they set this church up called the Glandor Family Church, where sisters have equal rights across the board in the management of the ecclesia, platform duties, the works. Okay, so it's happening. That's why I'm reading this out. Trained to usefulness of cultivated intellect, and with moral sentiments purified and ennobled by the nurture and admonition of the Lord's truth, women are helps meet for the Elohim, and much too good for men of ordinary stand. And my wife's much too good for me, I can tell you that. The sex is susceptible of this exaltation, though I despair of witnessing it in many instances till the age to come. But even women of this excellency of mind and disposition, were it possible for such, because it wasn't possible in his day, to do so, would be guilty of indiscretion, presumption, and rebellion against God's law, in assuming equality of rank, equality of rights, and authority over man, which is implied in teaching and preaching. It is the old ambition of the sex to be equal to the gods. But in taking steps to attain it, they involve themselves in subjection to men. Preaching and lecturing women are but species of actresses who exhibit upon the boards for the amusement of sinful and foolish men. Pretty torrid language, isn't it? It's the old lead balloon stuff today, isn't it? It's going to go down pretty well. He goes on to say this: they aim at an equality for which they are not physically constituted. They degrade themselves by the exhibition, and in proportion as they rise in assurance, they sink in all that really adorns a woman, because they've inverted the divine principle. I mean, God knew what he was doing, didn't he? And the world thinks they know better. And we've got some people in our brotherhood who think they know better. They don't understand this principle, heirs together the grace of life. It's about submission of the wife to the husband. So how did you feel? Test your reaction. Helpless Israel was written in late 1848 at the end of a long lecture tour through the UK. And it was designed mainly for interested friends, not for Christadelphians. I mean, many Christadelphians haven't read it. And it wasn't designed for Christadelphians primarily, it's for interested friends. It was lectures. Copies were sent to parliaments and to monarchs. And they even sent a copy to the Tsar of Russia, because he was a subject of it in the third part. You know, go, get the land it may go. Well, Russia was a flea-bitten, third-rate country in 1848. But Brother Thomas knew that it would be the power that came down on the mountains of Israel. That's why he sent a copy to the Tsar of Russia. Some challenged the biblical interpretation about trinities and immortal souls and all that sort of stuff, but nobody challenged the position of women in society. Not one voice. That book today would be burned, wouldn't it? In the modern, you took that into a school and read out what I just read, they would burn it, wouldn't they? What about your reaction? You know, I didn't expect any of you to feel uncomfortable. You know, I did this elsewhere, and a young brother came to me and said, you know, I felt very, but I absolutely agree with the truth. But I felt uncomfortable. He's honest. Why? Why do you feel uncomfortable? Because he's been to college. He's been to school. He reads newspapers. And it's there all the time, isn't it? It's a quality business. It's there. You can't avoid it. It's like the frog in water, isn't it? You put a frog in hot water, he jumps out. But you put the frog in cold water and just start to heat it up slowly, the frog stays, it's getting pretty good in here, until he roasts and boils. That's what happens, isn't it? We get marinated by what's going on in our society. So that's why, that's why you feel uncomfortable, even though you might wholeheartedly agree with the scriptural position. So be on your guard, brothers and sisters, especially young people, especially young sisters and young girls, because the world's after you. They're after you. And they want you to change your attitude. They want you to abandon divine principles and to operate like them, like the humanists. And that leads to disaster. If you feel uncomfortable, perhaps even upset, then you have been impacted to some degree by the three unclean spirits. So what do you do about that? Well, it's time to rechart our course or to confirm. If we stand by the principles of God, it's time to confirm that and to say, I am not going to be corrupted by these unclean spirits like frogs. So that when Christ comes, he'll say, you can keep your garment. You've been a faithful watchman in the house of God. You can keep your garment. To others, he's going to say, you're naked. You're not wearing a garment. You'll burn it before their eyes and dismiss them from temple service.